Ahead of this summer's transfer window, Newcastle United striker Alexander Isak is Europe's most wanted player with 21 Premier League goals, 25 in all. He's in the form of his life. In this video, I'm going to answer your questions on the striker, whether he's going to stay, how much he'd cost, what's going to happen this summer, and exactly what Newcastle United are going to do to try and keep him. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Welcome back to another video. Thanks so much for all of your support. Please continue to like, share and subscribe. I've got a lot of big plans for this channel going forward. A lot more videos, a lot more content in the planning, but please do like, share and subscribe. Your support really helps me on my journey to make this channel much bigger. Get in the comments as well. Let me know your thoughts on this video. Let me know your thoughts on Alexander Isak as a player, where you think his future lies. But I promised a video on Isak because it's obviously such a hot topic. Newcastle fans are being bombarded from outside with lots of talk about Isak's future, lots of entitlement in the past few months from other fans, from Arsenal, Liverpool, plenty of other clubs as well. But the tide does seem to be turning and he does seem to be more likely to stay at Newcastle. And I asked for your questions a couple of hours ago before I sat down to record. So thanks so much for the people who got in touch. The very first question is from Steph, who asks, will Isak sign a new contract if Newcastle United qualify for the Champions League this season? And the answer to that, I think, is that's where the most likely scenario lies. If he signs a new contract, it'll be because they're in the Champions League, most likely. But also, if they get into the Champions League, I think that that's what will happen. That doesn't mean that necessarily he'll stay forever. I think the key thing about a contract signing is value protection as well as longevity. Yes, Newcastle don't want to lose Isak at all, but they certainly don't want to lose him for anything less than their maximum value. Then his maximum value, he's got 3 years to run his current deal. Newcastle are in a fantastic position this summer in terms of charging 150, 200 million pounds, whatever they want to do. They're in the driving seat this summer, and I'll talk a little bit more about where he could possibly go or potential interest in him in a little bit. But generally speaking, they're in a very strong position this summer. That dwindles when the contract runs down, and the fact that he will have 2 years in his contract next summer, then a year the following summer, and then he could go for free at the age of 28 is quite a risk for Newcastle. And if they don't continue to progress, Isak's head might turn and he may well look to engineer a situation where he's got more power and Newcastle are not in a stronger position to ask for as much money. So that's where the thought process of a new contract comes from, because while he deserves to be rewarded, while Newcastle want to keep him for as long as possible, if he signs a new contract, then it keeps that ability to charge 150, 200 million in play for a lot longer than just this summer. And when he's hitting his peak age, Newcastle will have the power to charge a huge amount of money and cash in on him at that point if they have to, because I don't think anyone should go into this summer blindly, because the truth is with Isak that Newcastle need to maintain their end of the bargain effectively. They need to grow at a rate that keeps him happy and keeps him content at the club, because he is absolutely showing this season that he's one of the best players in the world, and those clubs that can offer him title challenges and potential trophy wins will be interested in this summer, and that's what Newcastle are effectively battling against. Having said that, the Carabao Cup was a massive deal for the club, not just getting the monkey off the back of 70 years without a domestic trophy, but showing the current players and showing potential other players that this is a club that's going places. Getting in the Champions League is the next stage of that, and that is really crucial. So I understand Steph's question about the Champions League and being the most important factor, because as a player of his quality, he's going to want to play in the Champions League, and it's something that Newcastle can say to Isak, that if he stays at the club, he'll be in the Champions League. The club is growing, but as I say, it doesn't guarantee that he'll stay forever. But for me, the most important thing is protect and value, because the reality is, in a PSR world and with all the competition at the top, it's unlikely that Newcastle are going to be in a position to match Isak's level within even 2 years, because as I say, he shouldn't just be playing in the Champions League, he's good enough to win the Champions League. That's where his direction is, and those clubs who are in that conversation, Liverpool, Arsenal, obviously got to the Champions League semi-finals, Real Madrid, Barcelona, have all been linked with him over the last year or so. So that's what Newcastle have to handle here. But he's extremely happy I think he's extremely settled. I think also the fact that he's the main man and there is obvious linear progression at Newcastle that's quite clear on the pitch. With Champions League money, they're in a position to give him a pay rise. Just for a bit of context, he's the third highest paid player at Newcastle now since Bruno and Joe Linton have signed new contracts. He was the highest paid player when he arrived on £120,000. So he's already handsomely paid in a way that the other players weren't really. So from the club's perspective, there isn't a huge rush to bump up his salary, but Isak's got to capitalise on this, absolutely. And the fact that he knows that this next contract is the biggest contract he'll ever sign, that's what Newcastle have to be at the table and ready to offer him in their perspective as well. They've got to hold up an end of the bargain here as well to make sure that they keep their star asset happy. And I think in the Champions League he'll sign a contract, but my prediction is that it'll have a release clause, and I would make it for foreign clubs, Real Madrid, Barcelona. The truth is that any player in Isak's situation is unlikely to give away the control of their career, a long-term contract without a route out of it. You've seen with players like Harry Kane where that actually has been a hindrance to them when they've signed long contracts and then the clubs have held the cards. I think Isak's people will be looking at it thinking, you're one of the best players in the world, you want to be playing it for the best teams. Well, if Newcastle can't promise that, then you do need a route out of the club if you need it. It doesn't mean that Isak will be looking for it. It doesn't certainly mean that he'll be looking for it this summer. But Newcastle being in the Champions League will absolutely give them a lot more cards to play in those contract talks. Incidentally, I don't think he'll sign anything this summer. I think they'll be heading into September with the status quo as it is in terms of his future. Lots of clubs like Liverpool and Arsenal and, as I say, Real Madrid. I'll get into that. There's another question on where he could go. I'll explain that. But yes, I think Champions League is absolutely crucial to him signing a new contract. But also, he is extremely happy at Newcastle and he's been constantly asked about it. He hasn't committed anything. He hasn't said that he's talking about long term when he's answering these questions, but he said he's very happy at the club. The club is all for him. The team has been built around him. That's the sort of thing that players really enjoy. And I think that because Newcastle have shown that they can win trophies and because they're looking extremely likely to be in the Champions League, there's a real opportunity for Isak to sign a new contract and bump his salary up, commit to the next couple of years at Newcastle before maybe considering his options, because there's lots of PSR headroom. It really feels like Newcastle are heading into the next phase of their project this summer with the Champions League. I think he'll sign a new contract eventually, but there might be a couple of caveats like a release clause to allow him to move to a foreign club. We'll move on to the second question from Ashley Wills. Where could Isak feasibly go if he were to leave, and when? He suggested Barcelona 2026 or Bayern Munich in 2027. I think the truth of the matter is that every club in the world, if there's a sniff that Alexander Isak is available at any price, might just look at it. And there's Liverpool and Arsenal, the most prominent Premier League clubs of interest. Chelsea obviously asked the question last summer due to the PSR issues that aren't going to haunt Newcastle this year, but it was really telling then when there was conversations about Anthony Gordon and the sales of Yankuba Minter and Elliot Anderson that even in that situation Alexander Isak was untouchable, off the table. So it'll be difficult, I think, for a lot of clubs to afford him. We know that he'd be Arsenal's top target. David Ornstein in The Athletic said that Liverpool will be interested as well, but would only be interested if he were legitimately available. So I think both of those clubs will look elsewhere and maybe monitor the situation with Isak's contract and maybe look to pounce further down the line. The clubs that I fear most when it comes to Isak are Real Madrid and Barcelona, and I know a lot of people in the comment section will think Barcelona have no money, there's no chance of them being involved because they simply have to pull all these financial levers just to survive, and I understand that. But in 2021, we were told that they were expected to go out of business and they couldn't afford Lionel Messi on his wages and they couldn't afford to register anybody. And yet, here they are standing as a Champions League semi-final team, looking likely to win La Liga again with Robert Lewandowski up front and a lot of quality players and one of the best teams that they've seen in quite a few years. And I've also spoken to someone in Barcelona who says that they think that they can get a deal done and they are interested this summer. So if they think they can get a deal done and they're not just delusional, then what is the reality? I think Isak, like everybody, would have their head turned by a place like Barcelona. I think in terms of stylistically away from Newcastle, it's the club that suits him best. Robert Lewandowski is 37 next year. He's not going to be able to carry on scoring goals at the rate he has forever. They're going to have to look for a replacement. Isak is the perfect fit, the perfect age, and they are in a position where they don't really need to find solutions across the pitch, like Arsenal or Liverpool have other positions and other quality to add elsewhere, Barca could theoretically go in straight with a bid with a huge bid this summer and test Newcastle's resolve, and I think that could be quite difficult. Real Madrid are a club that are now really searching for a new identity because of their Champions League exit. There's a lot of pressure from the hierarchy. I think Carlo Ancelotti's not going to be there next summer, but they will be looking for a new direction, and often a new direction means signing a new player, and they're a club that has already sorted their right-back situation by the sounds of it with Trent Alexander-Arnold on a free transfer. They could look elsewhere for another centre-back. That's possible, but they tend to go for players who have got big status. They tend to go for players who are in form and being discussed in the way that Isak is, the way that Gareth Bale was, James Rodriguez at the World Cup in 2014. This is a club with precedent for doing this sort of thing. When they go in and sign the most talked about player and the biggest name in the game at that point, I think Isak has got a case for being that. So if they want a striker, then they very much will be in the market for Isak, I think. Endrick is 17, 18, not quite ready. Mbappe might go out to the wing this summer because either Rodrigo or Vinicius Jr. could even be sold. So I think there's lots of stuff to be talked about with Real Madrid as well. For the Premier League clubs, I think there's too much work to be done for Arsenal to be able to afford him, with also strengthening in midfield and elsewhere. And with Liverpool, obviously, they want a new right-back, they want another centre-back. There's lots of other issues that they've got to solve. And if they're only at the table if Newcastle say that he's available, they might look elsewhere for a striker. I'm more worried, as I say, about clubs abroad. Not necessarily this summer. I think in Real Madrid, the other thing to mention about them is that they are very good and they have turned their sort of transfer policy around to be more proactive with contracts. So you see with Trent Alexander-Arnold, they've been in his ear for a couple of years and now they're going to get him on a free. They did the same with Antonio Rudiger. They did the same with Kylian Mbappe. They get in touch with players and see what the situation is, and that could be very dangerous for Newcastle down the line in terms of the value I mentioned in the first question. What happens with Isak and his valuation? That's why I think a new contract offer with a set price for foreign clubs active next summer might be the way forward, because that is open, it's adult, it's a good compromise. It gets him to stay and help Newcastle to the next level, but also guarantees that he might not come back to haunt them domestically, which is a crucial thing. So I do think that he's most likely to go back abroad. Also, the other thing to say about Isak is he's very much a big La Liga fan. He grew up watching La Liga as opposed to the Premier League. He is on record saying that Santiago Bernabeu is his favourite stadium as well. So there's lots of those little things that might seem trivial at the time, but I think if those clubs come to the table, lots of people might say that Newcastle are fighting a losing battle in terms of keeping him. As I say, to answer my overview of those two questions is, I think Newcastle have a good chance of keeping him immediately. The important thing is to sell at the right time if they have to, minimise the reaction to what happens if he goes, and get the most money for him and then move on and rebuild slightly, because the team has been built around him. He is absolutely the perfect striker for Newcastle in terms of his movement. I even think he has shown in recent weeks that he is the best player for Newcastle, despite not scoring as many goals. We've seen how frustrated he's been getting. He did get back on the score sheet last night as I record. I don't think Alexander Isak is going anywhere this summer. I think he might well sign a new contract, but it will be very heavily conditioned and with ways that he can leave if Newcastle don't match his ambition. Newcastle are in a very unique situation that I don't think they've been in before. They have, as I say, one of the most talked about and most wanted players in Europe, but also strikers are going to be the defining thing of this summer. Every big club wants one, and Newcastle have the best. So that's a very interesting scenario, an interesting dynamic. There's going to be a lot of conversations. Another sort of slightly funny question from Simon Wilson was, what chant does Isak prefer? Obviously there's two main ones, the who put the ball in the Mackham's net, and also the version of ABBA's Gimme, Gimme, Gimme. I think that's his favourite. A few months ago I spoke to Swedish TV, and lots of it was about the fact that they got this song about him, and they really enjoyed that sort of connection that he's got with that song's got with his homeland, and I think that's his favourite song, just to answer that question. But there's a couple of other questions I want to get through as well. Paul has asked, what's the defining quality of Alexander Isak's game? And I think this is why I wanted to touch on this. Lots of people have talked about goals and the natural ability to score them, and the fact that he's become the first player to score 20 plus goals in the Premier League in consecutive seasons for Newcastle. And obviously he's pretty much every time he's been fit, he's been scoring goals, and I think that's really crucial. For me, I think actually he's been more impressive in different ways in recent weeks. Yes, his frustrations of not scoring goals have been growing, and he had a number of chances against Crystal Palace and then scored the most difficult one to make it 5-0. He obviously had a couple of missed chances against Brentford before scoring and then going off. But for me, it's his work rate and his positioning, his ability to link up with both Gordon and Murphy. Murphy just gets the ball straight into him, so he's always got opportunities to score. But he drops deep, he moves out wide, brings defenders with him, creates space for others. I think his intelligence, the fact that assist that he laid on for Sandro Tonali against Manchester United, for example, that's what we've really seen. It's not like he's not been scoring, so he's not been impactful and not been helping Newcastle. He's still been as threatening and as much of a package as he had been previously. And I think for me, he's almost shown more why Newcastle have built around him and why he's so crucial to Newcastle. Because actually, since their form has turned up in December time, the last 20, I think they've won 18 of the last 24 games in all competitions, and he scored so many goals in those games. They've also started to find him a little bit more, and in terms of his positioning, in terms of him on the shoulder, everything about him. He's a modern number 9, where he's got the ability to run in behind, he's got the height, he's got the power, but he's also got the touch and the skill and the close control that sort of means that he can do various different attacking roles across the front three. And I think he's absolutely phenomenal, and he's shown in recent weeks exactly why, for me, as I say, Newcastle need to keep him this summer, because if they don't, then there's a huge gap to fill, and actually that is the sort of thing that can really, all this momentum that they've built with him and Sandro Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes and Harvey Barnes since he's come in for Anthony Gordon, Jacob Murphy as well. That all of those players being in form, getting into the Champions League, it would all be almost for nothing if they then have to go and replace Isak in the summer. John has asked me, is Alexander Isak injury prone? And the answer to this for me is absolutely not. I understand why people say that he is. He came in, got a hamstring injury, I think, in his first year that kept him out for 5 months. And then last year he had the groin problems, constantly in issues, constantly hobbling out of games. And then this year, but this year I think he's really shown that he has got that consistency in his fitness. I think that's come down to James Bunt. So I think last season Newcastle had a lot of injuries because they had a lot of games and lots of players were playing consistently at 60-70%, and Isak was constantly coming back without really being fully fit. This season, more opportunity to rest has helped him, but also I think James Bunt has had an influence on Eddie Howe in terms of the intensity of training. I think that's why Eddie Howe has reduced the intensity of the way Newcastle play. They want to control games more, so players aren't going full pelt all the time. But also, you saw it against Brentford. They conceded the goal. Isak had a little knock. He still came off, and there was, even though Newcastle had just conceded, and lots of people were probably a bit concerned about their ability to go on again and win that game, Isak came off because there's an absolutely no risk approach to his fitness. And I think ultimately that's why there's a lot of talk about his fitness levels, and that's why there's a lot of questions about this groin problem, because if there's any sort of little doubt about it, then he comes off and doesn't play, and there's lots of talk around that, whereas normally players often play 80-85% fit. I think because of Isak's importance and because of the fact that Newcastle need him fit for as many games as possible, that's why there's a sort of no-risk approach. And I did write about that for Forbes in an article a couple of weeks ago after the Brentford game, having been in Eddie Howe's press conference. Thanks so much for joining me on this video. Like, share and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate all the support as usual. There's plenty more content to come. I'll be at the Ipswich game in a couple of weeks. Apologies I wasn't at Crystal Palace, but plenty more to come from this channel. So like, share and subscribe. Get involved. Let me know in the comment section if you have any more Alexander Isak questions. Let's keep this conversation going, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.